some time for a few more attendees to come on board. We've got about 46 at the moment and many more are joining. So we'll just wait about 20 seconds just to give people a little bit of time to enter into the webinar. So I'm just going to check with Alba, just the co-organiser, that she can hear me. So if she can just send me a quick chat and just to make sure that everything is okay. Great. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar 2 of the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative. This is the first webinar that we're having in English, and we've got some exciting speakers to hear from today. We also have over 200 people registered for the webinar. So we're looking forward to hearing your questions and thoughts on the topic of urban food systems in a changing climate. My name is Alison Watson and I will be your moderator today. I work within the Sustainable Food Systems team at the United Nations Environment Programme based in Paris, and I'm going to be supported by my co-organisers of the webinar today, Alba Gaspar from the International Urban Food Network and Edward Marchand from the Fondation Nicolas Hulot. Before we go any further, I'd like to take you through some simple housekeeping to help you use the GoToWebinar platform. So your screen that you have in front of you should look something like this. You'll see on the left the GoToWebinar viewer through which you can see the presentation. And to the right is the GoToWebinar control panel where you can ask questions. Now, your control panel will collapse automatically when not in use. So if you want to keep it open, you can click the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. Now, we really want to encourage you to ask lots of questions to all our speakers today. You can do this by using the question tool in your control panel. It's right here and it's very easy to use. Now, today's presentation is being recorded and we'll provide a copy of all the presentations at the end of the webinar series. You may also notice that we've provided 2 handouts for you to download. These handouts provide some background information on the speakers today and some of their publications, and also provide some background information on the Food Climate Change Research Network. Okay, I'm just going to try something. It may not work, but oh no, it doesn't work because it's been disabled, so that won't work. So we're going to move on, and we're going to give you some background information about the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative. So this initiative was launched by UNEP-IUFN and Foundation Nicolas Hulot in September this year. The aim is to raise awareness on the important linkages between sustainable food systems, sustainable urban development and climate change. As part of the initiative, we're producing 4 webinars, 2 in English and 2 in French, involving international experts from around the world, 1 to 2 short movies, a fast-paced, fact-filled look at the underside of our urban food system within a changing climate, and a joint policy perspectives paper, which will raise awareness on the need for action towards sustainable urban systems in a changing climate. Now, today's webinar is focusing on the understanding of the linkages between climate change, food and urban areas. The program for today's webinar will follow this structure. We'll hear first from Matthew Thomas at the Greater London Authority on London's experience with understanding the climate footprint of their food sector and what they're doing to reduce that. We'll then have a question and answer session with Matthew straight after his presentation, and he may be accompanied by a colleague of his as well to help answer those questions. After that, we'll have 2 speakers, Tara Garnett and Jane Battersby, followed by a joint question and answer session. So let's get started with hearing from speaker number 1. In 2008, the Greater London Authority commissioned a report on the London's food sector greenhouse gases. This study was groundbreaking and thought-provoking at the time and showed the nature and scale of the contribution of food to the capital's greenhouse gas emissions. And it's inspired the Greater London Authority to commission work on the Scope 3 indirect emissions attributed to food consumption. Now, Matthew, I'm going to give you the microphone to talk to us about this work. I'm just going to ask you to just wait a few seconds before you speak to allow it to transfer to you. And I've also enabled you to be the presenter, so please load your presentation in full format by pressing on that share screen button. So I'll just do that now. And I believe you have the sound, and I'm just now enabling you to share your screen. So you should be able to press on the show my screen button.
Yep.
Great, that's looking good.
There we go. Okay, brilliant. Does that come through okay?
That is perfect, and we can hear you very well. So start when you're ready.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks Alison for inviting us along here today to give this webinar. My name is Matthew Thomas. I work in the Energy and Climate Change team at the GLA, which is the Greater London Authority, and I'm pleased to be accompanied by my colleague, Mark.
Hello, I'm from the food team at the GLA, and I'll tell you in a minute about the food strategy for London, which the Mayor has had for the last coming up 10 years.
So we're going to do a little bit of a double act, and hopefully between us we'll be able to cobble together responses to your questions. So just to add a little bit of sort of content to what we're going to be talking about, I'm not sure how familiar most of the participants are with the Greater London Authority and the Mayor of London, so we'll give a very brief introduction to that. And then Mark will talk a little bit about the broader kind of food agenda in London and what we're doing. I'll then talk a bit about indirect emissions and how we view something called PAS 2070 to look at food emissions. And I suppose the important question after that is kind of why. So what? Why are we using those results, and why do we think this is a useful exercise to undertake? So I'm sure you all know where London is. Anyway, here's a map. In terms of the governance in London, Mark and I work for the Greater London Authority, which is led by the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, and we are essentially a strategic body responsible for planning and budget setting. So the GLA group incorporates Transport for London, the Met Police, and the London Fire Authority. So within London we have 33 local authorities or boroughs, and it's primarily the boroughs who deliver a lot of the services in terms of waste collection, libraries, schools, all that sort of thing. And we provide a regional strategic body to coordinate some work with those boroughs around a number of different issues, including food and our energy and climate change policies. So just to add a tiny bit of context in terms of London, we have around 8.5 million people, which is likely to grow to about 11.5 by 2050. It's a huge area, over 1,600 square kilometres. And our emissions in, I think it's 2013, were in the region of about 40 million tonnes of CO2. So now I'm just going to hand over to Mark, who's going to give a brief intro into sort of food in London and the work of the London Food Board.
Thanks, Matt. Hello, everyone. Yeah, this is Mark. So as this logo-rich slide shows, there is a body called the London Food Board that was established in 2004, and its role, the logos you see are the current members, and I'll talk a bit about them in a second, but the role of that board is to advise the Mayor of London through a food advisor on what priorities the Greater London Authority could or should do in partnership with others to address all the varied challenges in the food system. And of course those challenges change and evolve, and some go up the scale of importance and some go down throughout time as as you might imagine. So, for example, a few years ago there was an economic recession, so then a lot of our focus went around the London economy and jobs and so on, and what contribution food could make to the economy. And all of that is against the background of a food strategy for London, which was launched by the previous mayor in 2006. It's called the Mayor's Food Strategy, Healthy and Sustainable Food for London, and that strapline really gives us a clue as to why we're focusing increasingly on carbon and the environmental side of the way London's food system works. That is a science which, at least by us, wasn't very well understood when we launched in 2006, when the strategy launched, but that we've got more and more to grips with as time has gone by. And Matt, so I'm in the food team, the environment team have done the, if you like, the number crunching and the science that sits behind our work on that. That's why Matt will describe that in a second. But what you can see from these logos is we've got basically people from right across the food sector, so big supermarkets, big sort of retailers in the UK, through to campaigning organisations such as Sustain, food distribution charities such as Fair Share and Food Cycle and others, restaurateurs, Fair Trade, Friends of the Earth, and so on, to try to make sure that we get everyone's perspective and do work that can help as many people in London as possible. So that's what that is, the London Food Board. And the document you can see on the left with the apples is what the food strategy looks like when it was launched in 06. There was an implementation plan which has strawberries on it there in 2007. And the reason we put those there is because that's when it started to inform the first work of the Greater London Authority, the first work ever, actually. Because when we launched in 2006, a lot of people in London and a lot of people, frankly, in this building didn't really know why food was important because, well, we all have food every day, don't we? Well, the answer is no, frankly, now, more and more sadly. And the food system kind of works, doesn't it? Because when I go to the shop, there's always food there, isn't there? Well, that doesn't really go, that doesn't tell the full story, does it? So the food strategy really helped people to start to get their heads around almost like the negative impacts or the externalities, or you know, the full impact of the way London's food system works. Because, as Matt said, if we've got nearly 9 million people here, that's people who live here, let alone the people who come in to work here every day and then go and live outside London, as well as a booming tourist economy. That's a lot of meals, so it's 30 million meals a day. So London sucks in all those resources, consumes some of them, and then spits out the negative externalities associated with that. So we started to try to get our head round how the system works, to explain why it's important to everyone in London and to policy people in London. Even if you think food is not to do with you, it is to do with you, whatever you do. That's the story we've been trying to tell.
Cool, thanks, Mark. So our first, I suppose, foray into looking at greenhouse gas emissions and focusing on the food sector was undertaken in 2008. And I suppose this was the first look at food consumption on greenhouse gas emissions, both inside and outside of London's boundaries. I won't focus too much on the findings because they've been a little bit superseded by sort of previous work, but it's this that really, I suppose, inspired us to go and look at Scope 3 or indirect emissions in a bit more detail. Okay. So the next step for us was called the publicly acceptable standard, which is basically a methodology for measuring the greenhouse gas emissions of a city. This followed on from a climate change mitigation and energy strategy, which the Mayor published in 2011, and then using this this standard, which was developed by BSI, so the British Standards Institution, but funded by the Greater London Authority. We use this PAS 2770 methodology to apply it to London and start to tease out some of the Scope 1, 2 and 3, so indirect emissions for London. I'll talk a little bit more about what those include on a slightly later slide. A bit more information on what is PAS 2070. Well, as I alluded to earlier, it's basically meant to be a methodology that can be applied anywhere, that allows a very consistent and reliable means of quantifying greenhouse gas emissions. It's free to download from the BSI, so that's British Standards Institution Network website, and the method is applicable to any urban area, anywhere. It uses two different but arguably complementary methods, one of which is called direct plus supply chain. This basically captures greenhouse gas emissions associated with the largest supply chains serving cities, from both activities within the city boundary and indirect emissions from consumption of grid-supplied electricity, district heating, transboundary travel, supply chains and consumption of key goods produced outside the city. And then the second method is called consumption-based, which basically captures the direct and life cycle emissions for all goods and services consumed by residents of a city. So it's purely based on consumption, and it doesn't assess the impact of production of goods within a city, only those goods that have been consumed, including those which have been produced from outside of the city's boundaries. And that's based on expenditure information. So when we're talking about scopes 1, 2, and 3, I mean, I'm presuming that the vast majority of participants are aware of these. Previous studies where we've looked at emissions just really incorporate scopes 1 and 2. So this is more sort of direct emissions from generating energy, from agriculture, from waste, from transport. And then scope 2 starts looking to it indirect in terms of looking at energy and electricity, which may be generated elsewhere but consumed within a city boundary. And then scope 3 really is sort of everything else. So it's all other indirect emissions, and really tries to build a complete footprint of an urban area's greenhouse gas emissions. So for London, we have something called the LEGI, which is our standard reporting of emissions, mainly based on energy use in buildings and also transports. And through that study, through the LEGI, we have a figure of about 44 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents. I think the latest figure was 2013. When we start looking at scope 3 emissions through the two methodologies that I've briefly outlined, we can see that for direct plus supply chain, that figure goes up to over 81 million tonnes. And for consumption-based, it goes up to over 114. This is based actually, I think, on data from these figures from 2010. Sorry, just correcting myself. The interesting thing here is looking at the total emissions from food and drink. So by using this PAS 2017 methodology, applying it to London, we found that the total emissions from food were about 9.2 million tonnes, and from drink about 1.5. So all in all, food's around sort of 10% of London's total scope 3 emissions. And just to put that into context, that's larger than emissions from all transport in London, and it's larger than the emissions from gas used in residential heating, buildings for heating water and air temperatures. There we go. So this study looked at what we're calling sort of cradle to gate greenhouse gas emissions based on economic final consumption, including commercial food production in London and non-commercial food production in London as well. The analysis was undertaken by Leeds University, and we undertook this, I think it was 2013, 2014. So we include greenhouse gas emissions from supply of food and drink, consumption by visitors, and we assume, sorry, consumption by visitors is excluded, missed out a key word there, and we assume that the greenhouse gas emissions from food and drink correlates well with expenditure on food and drink. So a couple of assumptions in there. So we've got commercial food production, which is farmed area, a number of livestock. Within London, that's pretty small. And non-commercial, so we're looking at other growing spaces, for example, allotments, and the area used for growing. So going back to those emissions which I mentioned earlier, the results we came out with were 9.2 million tonnes CO2 equivalent for food, 1.5 for drinks. If we look at what's actually produced in London, then that's a fairly tiny proportion, as you would imagine for a city like London. It's about 0.25% in terms of commercial food and non-commercial food. All this data from the study is available online. It's freely downloadable from something called the London Data Store. And if you just search PAS 2070, then all the spreadsheets that underlie it can be downloaded and played with at your convenience. So breaking those emissions down into a bit more detail, so what are the various kind of food and drink products that we're looking at, and what's their relative contribution? I suppose the key thing that stands out here is that there's not one sort of sector which completely dominates in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions and our scope 3 footprint. The highest there is I suppose, as expected, is looking at the meat products and also dairy. But then we have quite significant proportions, so 10% for vegetable and animal oils and fats. And alcoholic beverages seems to take up quite a large percentage, which is perhaps unsurprising for London. So I think the key thing with this is we've undertaken a lot of detailed sort of analysis. We've come up with some good figures, which are broken down sort of by sector. But then the question is, well, okay, what do we do with this information now we've got it? How can we use it to actually influence things? How can we use this data to then reduce our emissions and make London more sustainable in terms of its kind of food consumption, as well as its greenhouse gas emissions? So what we've been trying to, and I suppose we're quite lucky in a way, the setup at the GLA. We have the environment team, which I'm in, where we can undertake these kind of analyses, but we have a dedicated food team, which Mark is in, who can actually take the results and try and apply them and think about how we can use this on the ground to influence our policies, our projects, and those that we work with. So we've been taking some of the findings, and we can use them to focus our resources, which are quite limited, like a lot of public bodies, on working with some of the key food sectors. We're looking to influence policy, such as the London Plan, which is our regional planning document for London. And also this kind of work provides a lot of evidence for us to communicate that message of total kind of emissions and consumption to consumers, with the aim of then trying to influence behaviour and practice. And it really highlights the importance, I think, of household consumption.
So this is Mark again. So a couple of the next steps. This slide and the next slide will show a couple of next steps. So partly by virtue of the fact that we have been around since 2006 with a strategy, we've come to be seen by some as one of the leading exponents of how to implement food strategy in a very complex urban environment, clearly London being one of the busiest cities in the world. So we were proud and happy to be invited to Milan 2 weeks ago on the 15th and 16th of October. 16th was World Food Day, as you might know, and London, our mayor, became a signatory to the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which was launched on the 15th, an initiative which had been led for the last couple of years by the City of Milan government. And it says dozens of cities, in fact 115 mayors were in attendance and signed the pact that day. So we are, and that was against the backdrop of Milan having the World Expo, as you probably know, which ends on Saturday, which ends at the end of October. So we're now working with Milan and with others to see how that work will be taken forward in terms of what will be the governance structure, how will it report, etc., etc. So that is very much a work in progress. But the key thing for us was to, and the Pact is to encourage cities that already have food strategies to share best practice and to show by example how other cities across the world, cities in the developing world, cities of different sizes, how they can all think about food in a new way if they've never thought of food before, and develop food strategies of their own, so that we can start to have appropriate responses for cities around the world. So we're happy to be involved in that. It's very exciting. Another thing that we want to do in London is to take, as Matthew said, there are 32 or 33 boroughs in London. We want to take one of them, we don't know which one, early next year, and really work with academics and people in that borough to, what do you call it, baseline or assess how the food system works in that borough, how everything that comes in to do with food, where it comes from, and what, you know, so it's sort of life cycle analysis type thing, who consumes it, and we'll do food mapping stuff around that, and then we'll use all of that, a year or so of data collection, if you want to call it that, to inform and design what interventions we then put into that borough. For example, around, it's a very overused phrase and I apologize for that, but we could have food hubs in there so that we reconfigure the way that food works entirely in that borough. Already in London we are working, we have two, under the food programme we have two food flagship boroughs, which are both in South London. They are called Lambeth and Croydon, if you want to look them up. And in those two boroughs we are working with schools, with big retailers, with everyone who has anything to do with food in those boroughs. Each borough has about 300,000 people in London. So we're working with about 600,000 people who live there to reconfigure everything and to transform the food environment in those boroughs. We know a lot of Londoners are going hungry. We know there's a lot of food poverty. There's another food poverty report published today in the UK by the Fabian Society. Look it up. It's in the news. There was one last week, Sustain, which is a national campaign group based in London, published a London food poverty report. Again, look it up. Their website is called sustainweb.org, and look up London food poverty. So we know that there's a lot of people struggling to get food. We also know that there's a lot of people, there's problems with obesity and overweight. We know that there's a big debate about sugar in the UK at the moment, which went even further up the agenda last week, following work by Public Health England. We know that supply chains are complicated and that local supply chains have some part to play in making things better, if I could put it so simply. So what I didn't say about the London Food Board earlier, yeah, I did say there's a food advisor who chairs that group and advises the mayor. That advisor is a lady called Rosie Boycott, and she is currently very focused and passionate about carbon and about how it behoves, or it is appropriate for a city the size and importance of London to start thinking about how to set rigorous or challenging carbon targets so that we could reduce the carbon impact of the food system over a time period to be defined by a large 20% or whatever. We haven't set that we haven't set a figure, but we're thinking, you know, how can we make a big impact in carbon over the next, say, 20 years. So that's one London-centric thing that we're going to do starting early next year.
Cool, thanks Mark. I hope that just gives a flavour of sort of the methods that we've used, and then perhaps more importantly what we're trying to do with the information. So from influencing practice in other cities around the world, and I'm not sure if any have actually undertaken past 2070 studies. It'd be great if any have, who are on the webinar. Right down to a much more local, very detailed assessment, focusing on just one borough in London, and coming up with some very tangible actions that are influenced by the data and by the analysis in terms of what we can actually do to reduce emissions and increase efficiencies and tackle all of the other issues that Mark was talking about. So that's pretty much it from us. I know we've covered there quite a lot in quite a short space of time and haven't been able to go into too much detail. We'll be around for the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes if there are any questions. And I think we've got to shoot off. But you can always follow up with an email, and both our email addresses are on the screen at the moment. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matthew and Mark. And I'm sorry I didn't give a very good introduction before to Mark, but welcome. And you have a hello from Florence, I see. So there we go. You already have lots of questions as well. So I'm going to start off with a few questions. I might try and group them. So if I'll ask a few questions at a time just to make it a little bit easier for the speed and flow. So I have a question here around, or a couple of questions around urban-rural relationships. So what is the relationship with the London Greater Authority food strategy work and its work on greenhouse gas emissions with rural communities outside of Greater London Authority? That is one question. The second question was, were urban agricultural practices and their associated greenhouse gas emissions researched for the Greater London Food Sector Report? There's two questions.
Okay, I'll take them in the order that you said them. I wrote it down as the relationships between London and the rural communities. So let me describe. In London, in those 32 boroughs, there's 7% of the area of London is agricultural land, which is higher than most people would assume. So there is still, in certain areas, there is still some peri-urban agriculture, and of course around London is a lot of arable land within 100 miles. So we are historically and still conscious that we want to improve, strengthen, build, re-establish supply chains with farmers in those areas. So one project that we did, I'm doing this from memory, I think probably started about 7 years ago and went for a couple of years. In London there are 4 main wholesale markets, and 3 of them are focused on fruit and vegetables. They are at Western International near Heathrow Airport, New Spitalfields Market, which is right next to the Olympic Stadium, and one called New Covent Garden Market, which is just to the west of the West End, just to the west of Oxford Street, kind of, if you want me to put it in those terms. And there's one that's dedicated to fish, which is called Billingsgate. We didn't work with the meat one, which is called Smithfield. And what we did in the ones that I've mentioned, is that we paid for what we call the business development manager, a person to go into those markets and to be based there and to be like the conduit between the producers, the farmers, or whatever kind of producers they are, who find London physically and geographically a complicated place to get into and to bring vans down to and to get around and to get out of and to do drops efficiently. So you can see why London's complicated. And also for them to connect those producers to buyers. So whether those buyers might be restaurants who want to sell premium British produce, or schools or hospitals. The public sector is a big buyer of food, obviously. So just trying to connect the two ends of that supply chain, really. That was a successful project. Only one of the markets. And one of the things that the Greater London Authority does is to do projects where we think there's a market failure, or to test an idea. So we thought that was a market failure. It wasn't working very well. So our project did work well. Once we've shown that it worked, it was then the markets then had a choice to continue to engage the person. New Covent Garden Market still have the same person who did that then, and they continue to make a big thing out of British and local and seasonal and regional produce. So that's an example of how we've done it. But we're always very conscious of the need to do more of that, including in a carbon context. So that's a good question. The other, Alison, can you repeat the other question? I wrote about urban agricultural practices. I mean, one thing we do have is in 2008
yes,
we started.
Sorry, the question was that included in the greenhouse gas footprinting assessment, the urban agriculture?
Yes, yeah, it was. So I think, like I said in one of my slides, it turned out to be a very small proportion compared to the sort of consumption-based, which makes sense if you think of the 8.5 million people in London who are consuming sort of food and drink, and even though we may have 7% of our land area is kind of sort of rural and sort of peri sort of agriculture, I suppose. That's still producing a relatively small proportion of kind of food.
Having said that, that is correct what Matt said. But we have an ongoing project which started in 2008 called Capital Growth, which is going from which continues to grow actually, and it's initially was set up 2012 community food growing spaces in London by the end of 2012, because that was our Olympic year. That project became so successful that it has carried on and currently has about 2,500 community food growing spaces, some of which are quite big, some of which feed a lot of people in their area, some of which have turned themselves into businesses. So even though it's relatively small, as Matt implies, that sector still probably continuing to make a growing, no pun intended, but a growing contribution to that overall picture.
Excellent, thank you. I have two quick questions. We'll have to just probably answer these two questions and then move on to our next speaker. We're just running out of a little bit of time, but it's incredibly interesting, and I'm sure we'll be able to follow up and provide more information. The two questions I have now, one of them you may have already answered. Actually, I've got three questions. The first one was, are there any other cities doing the PAS 2070 or want to? And I think you said you weren't quite sure if there was, or you didn't know of any, but you can correct me. The second question was, do you know or did you take into account the levels of greenhouse gas emissions from food waste in London? And the last one I have for you, perhaps as a good question to end on, do you think that there's more awareness of these food issues in London as a result of all this work?
Okay, well, I can answer the first one fairly easily. Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't think any other cities have applied PAS 2070, but yes. But then again, a lot of other cities have, I'm sure, have done their own investigations into the food sector and emissions generated from it, both direct and indirect.
Food waste?
Sorry?
Food waste?
Food waste, yeah, I think food waste was included in the study where we could find some sort of data, but it was largely sort of an economic sort of evaluation. So yeah, it's predominantly produced on consumption.
Excellent. And the last question, just as maybe a good ending question, do you think there's more awareness now because of all this work that's happening in London and the focus around food and greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, Mark's probably got more than me to say on this, but I guess from our point of view that this analysis is quite, it's very technical, it's very sort of specific. It's really whether, I doubt many people have an awareness that we're looking at things in this kind of detail, but it's really then the sort of the front-facing projects and programs that people like the food board sort of lead on, and the food team here working with authorities and communities sort of directly, which really raises the profile of food issues in London.
Great. Well, thank you both. It was extremely interesting. There's some very detailed work there, very technical, but also a lot of work with building networks and focusing on what you can do in the future. We'll be probably inundated with lots of questions to follow up on, and
we'll be happy to do that. Can I just say as well, I'm really sorry that we can't stay longer, particularly because Tara Garnett is going to speak next, I think. Tara came and presented to the London Food Board last year and continues to be an inspiration to us. Oh, I can see a picture of you now. Hi, Tara. yeah, we're still really interested in what you're doing, and for those of you who haven't heard Tara speak before, you're in for a treat. So we're going to go now and let her speak.
Yeah, and we'll probably be in touch about our more detailed food emissions analysis as well. So anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today.
No, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the introduction to Tara Garnett as well, because I think what we will do is we'll move quite quickly into Tara's presentation now, just so that we've got time at the end for lots of questions, because both Tara and Jane are very good speakers and have got some very interesting work to share with us. But I think that's a great example from the London Greater Authority of the things that we should and can be looking at from a city perspective. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm going to introduce Tara. She is a researcher at University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute, and she's also the director, I'll call you the director, but she did set up the Food Climate Research Network, and she also runs it. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Tara. I'm just going to change the presenter to you, so you can accept to show your screen, and I'm just going to now change the audio as well. So if you just wait there, I'll ensure that you can talk. So I'm going to mute myself.
Great. Hello everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a bit about, present more of a kind of big picture overview of how food systems and climate change are connected, and specifically how they're relevant to looking at things from the urban scale, which has already been sort of fulsomely demonstrated in the case of London. I'm going to start by just providing a quick reminder for many of you who are probably taking part, who will already know this, that food is a very major contributor to climate changing greenhouse gas emissions at the global, however really you want to look at it, at the global level or at the national level. So those emissions arise largely because of the process of agricultural production, and you get emissions, both direct emissions from the process of farming, and that's methane and nitrous oxide, which are very potent greenhouse gas emissions, but you also get an equal amount of climate changing emissions that arise from agriculturally induced land use change. Farming is the biggest human user of land worldwide, and in order to do that farming and to cater to our growing population and to changing consumption patterns, we are clearing more land for agriculture, and that leads to the cutting down of trees and the uprooting of pastures and the consequent carbon dioxide release. So at the agricultural stage, you get these gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and deforestation-related carbon dioxide. And then beyond the farm gate, so once you've produced your food, reared your livestock, you have energy that's used in the process of storing, processing, chopping things up, cooking, heating, cooling, transporting, retailing, taking your food home, putting it in the fridge, cooking it, washing it up, etc., etc. And that contributes about a third of the overall food impact. So I'm just trying to make this work. I can't. There we are. I just wanted to show, sorry about that, I wanted to show this picture. Again, it graphically illustrates it. This system, this supply chain perspective, you get emissions arising from the production of agricultural inputs, on farm at the agricultural stage and the land use change, and then all the processes that go on from that. So if you look at it in this way, and we've already seen the London example, I'm now showing you a national level picture, and I'm taking the UK as an example of a very, very urbanised developed country. And you can see here from this picture that food-related greenhouse gas emissions account for about nearly a fifth of consumption-related the consumption-related UK total. And if you look at it at the breakdown of that, you can see that agricultural accounts for about 45%, nearly half of those emissions, and then you've got bits and pieces throughout the supply chain, packaging, food manufacturing, transport, and so on and so forth. And each country will vary depending on its level of industrialization. So the more industrialized the country, the relatively more important will be the post-harvest stages, because supply chains are much more energy intensive, and the less developed the country, the proportionately greater the relative impact the agricultural stage will be, simply because they have less industrialization that can add to the emissions total. So agricultural emissions at a global level, this is taken from the IPCC's latest fifth assessment report. Agricultural emissions are rising, and those emissions are generally mainly rising because of the growth in production of livestock, of the rearing of meat and dairy products, of animals for meat and dairy. You can see there from the, if I can show you the dark brown, the enteric fermentation and the manure management contributes to those. It's methane and nitrous oxide. And then you've got this dark brown, which is land use changes. And lots of that, as I mentioned, is agriculturally induced land use change. And those emissions are now falling, largely because we're starting to become a bit more successful in controlling deforestation and in also increasing yields on existing land. But you can never be sure, and you don't know how long those trends are going to be going on for. So the picture with agriculture is that direct agricultural emissions are rising, and that is a function of our growing demand for very greenhouse gas intensive foodstuffs, particularly meat and dairy products, but land use change related emissions are falling. So what's the connection with urban areas? Well, the most obvious point is that most people worldwide today now live in urban areas, however you define, not necessarily great big cities like London, but some kind of urbanized development. And of course the picture is very differentiated at a regional level, so some areas like Africa is much less urbanized than, say, Latin America or North America. But how these people eat in urban areas is absolutely critical to the course that our global food-related greenhouse gas emissions take, because of the most obvious point, which is that most food now produced feeds urban citizens. And because cities are centres of power and influence, decisions are made in cities and they drive future trends. So those decisions are made about how policymakers govern with respect to agriculture, what systems of agricultural production we support, what sorts of foods we encourage or disincentivize, and of course land use controls and policy. And of course industry has a huge influence on our consumption patterns at the retail, at the manufacturing, and in terms of out-of-home catering. So that cities are the places where people are most exposed to the forces of industrialization and marketing and advertising. And of course, what these urban citizens choose to consume or not to consume ultimately shapes the direction of the trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions. So the other point to make, and we've heard a lot about how food contributes to the problem of climate changing emissions, but the flip side of the coin is that our urban food provisioning is going to be very much affected by climate change, and some of those effects are very direct and some of them are less direct. So to take some direct obvious impacts, flooding and catastrophic events, they'll damage people by affecting our transport systems, our retail outlets, our electricity and water supplies, and also things like the internet, which affects social security payments, which affects that affordability side of the food security, that dimension there. People need to be able to afford the food. And also, as temperature rises, there is an increasing risk of food not reaching people in a safe condition, or in the rise of foodborne diseases. And that's particularly an issue when it comes to refrigeration. But I think it's also worth mentioning that as the temperature in cities changes and increases, then that in order to adapt to those changes, there will be a need for more refrigeration, more air conditioning, and so forth. And that in itself exacerbates the problem of climate change because it's energy using. And of course, temperature rises affect people's food preferences. So then you've got the indirect impacts. And again, the fundamental one is how climate change affects agricultural production, and there's growing body of evidence, and of course the picture is going to be different in different parts of the world, but on average climate change is going to negatively affect yields, and perhaps just as important, will increase variability. So it will be harder to predict what to grow, when to harvest, what we know about what's likely to be available in the coming year or 2 years. And of course, climate change also affects the nutritional content of food. There's some growing evidence that climate change will affect the protein and also the micronutrient content of food. So for people in low-income communities who are very, very dependent on agricultural commodities for those key nutrients, that's going to undermine their nutritional status. And of course, indirectly as well, climate change may be an additional driver of migration, and the rate at which migration occurs affects the ability of cities to absorb these new populations, to put in place social security, housing, and other measures that are necessary in order to ensure their safety and well-being. And as climate changes, it may have impacts on other sectors that might affect things like competition for water. Agriculture is the major user of irrigation water worldwide, but there's going to be increasing competition from other sectors. So there's going to be more people jostling around for a smaller slice of the pond, as it were. And then again, urbanisation may affect the availability and the quality of land for agriculture, which is another stress. So I think we've heard a bit about climate change, but I think there's also a need to look at the nutrition and the health dimension. And the problem is changing, and these figures are they came out very prominently in the Global Nutrition Report that came out just a couple of weeks ago. We're doing a good job of addressing hunger and underconsumption, but we still have 800 million people worldwide who are hungry. But the balance of the problem is starting to shift now. 2 billion people are overweight or obese. Poor diets defined in terms of those that are high in sugar, fat, salt, and low in fruit and vegetables are now the leading cause of death globally, which is an astonishing development. And then you have that hidden hunger of micronutrient deficiencies, 2 billion people. And all this is going hand in hand with and interlinked with the nutrition transition, which is the transition from traditional diets to those that are high in food, salt, sugar, fat, and animal products. And again, particularly the animal products side of things, this is a very greenhouse gas intensive way of eating, and there are implications, and also it's associated with the rise in non-communicable diseases. We've heard a lot in the press recently about the link between processed meat and cancers. This is not really new news. It's just that the WHO have actually come out and said this, but that's just one very tangible link between our current dietary patterns and ill health. So these are just some figures to illustrate people are not just eating more, and you can see those figures comparing 1961 to 2009 for a selection of countries, but they're eating more of those foods that have a high environmental impact and are also associated with certain negative health impacts. So that's the meat component. And it's not just a poor world problem. As you can see from these slides, obesity and chronic diseases are now a poor world problem as well, mainly upper middle and lower middle income countries rather than the lowest of the low income countries, but the trends are going in that direction. So if they're not today's problem or even tomorrow's problem in sub-Saharan Africa, they may be the day after tomorrow's problem, and it needs to be thought about. So there's just another picture which shows that when it comes to women, the world is kind of fat now, and the figures for men show some very similar statistics, a similar picture. So the question is, how does urbanisation affect all this? And the simple answer is that, in general, urban populations are more likely to be overweight and obese than rural populations, and they're more likely to eat meat. But that very simplistic generalization needs to be nuanced. It's complicated and it's context specific, because although on the one hand urbanization does have this link with obesity and higher meat intakes, and I mention the meat partly because of the health link and partly because of the climate link, the reasons for this are that incomes tend to be higher on average, and with huge exceptions in urban areas, and then they can therefore afford these obesogenic and high impact foods. These sorts of foods are much more available through supermarkets, fast food outlets and so forth, and there's more exposure to marketing by international food businesses. Lifestyles tend to be a bit more sedentary. Again, I'm going to qualify all that in a minute. They may have 2 or 3 jobs on the go all the time, and therefore less time to cook. And people eat, and as a result, people eat out more. And there is quite good evidence linking eating out and the consumption of junk food. And junk food is often meat-based and very energy-dense. So, but then there's the other hand, and it's also, particularly in sort of high-income countries, rural populations, and that should say in high-income countries, also have very poor eating patterns. And in fact, obesity in rural parts of the United States is higher than obesity in urban parts. And rural populations, again, in high-income countries tend to be more car dependent because there isn't that urban public transport infrastructure. Cities can actually, ironically, be much more walkable. Urban populations in general are more educated, and beyond a certain level of income and education, those two factors are connected: lower body mass index and higher levels of education. And there are some signs that once you've increased your income and increased your meat consumption, beyond a certain point of income increase, meat consumption at least stabilizes and perhaps declines, although that's an area that needs to be looked at in a bit more detail. And then finally, the really important point that needs to be made, which is that urban slum dwellers, this doesn't necessarily apply to the very poorest of the poor in low-income countries who are very insecure and who suffer from problems particularly of stunting and diets that are very impoverished in many senses. So I think the point there is that the link between urban, food, climate and health, those 4 key words, are that factors such as income, education, technology, and that's not just the supply chain infrastructure, but your access to things like TVs that expose you to advertising, and your the transport infrastructure that's in place. All these mediate that relationship, and they're more significant than some kind of magic phenomenon that we might call urbanization per se. So what's the conclusion? I think the challenge is that we need to look at both sides of the climate coin. We need to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are arising from the places, the consumption habits of where most people now live, but that are also resilient in the face of climate change. And that while we go about our business of trying to address climate change and be resilient in the face of it, we need to think about the fact that food is ultimately to eat, and it nourishes us, and we need to develop food systems that also enhance our food security in all its dimensions and that enhance the nutritional status of urban populations. So I think that's pretty much it. I'd also say that anyone is welcome to join the Food Climate Research Network. The Food Climate Research Network is about building a growing community of people who are focused one way or another on trying to address food system challenges. It's easy to join online, and to find out more, just go online or send me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was, sorry, I'm just changing over to Jane presentation. That was incredibly incredibly interesting and gave us a very good background to the topic as well. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to save questions for you, Tara, for the end of the session, because I'm going to now move into Jane's presentation. Now, as an introduction to everyone, Jane is a researcher at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's worked extensively in African countries and on connecting household food security to wider structural drivers of food insecurity. Her interest in the food, climate change and cities nexus is grounded in that understanding of the changing nature of food insecurity in Africa in the wake of rapid urbanisation. Now, Jane, I'm going to change the presentation keyboard to you. So when you're ready, you should see a blue button. And I'm going to just make sure that your audio is on. So I will just change that as well. Excellent. Can you talk now, Jane?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. So when you're ready to start, go ahead.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, it's been an absolute treat hearing the first two speakers, and I'm going to try and be relatively brief because I know we're running out of time. But I was concerned that I might say the same thing as everybody else has said before, but thankfully that doesn't seem to be the case. So I work for the Consuming Urban Poverty Project, which is a project working on food systems governance in Africa, and trying to use food as a way to understand and alleviate poverty. I realise I'm coming very much from a perspective of an Africanist, and also from the perspective of trying to help our local governments think through what their response to climate change and food security might be. So essentially the points are that we can't continue to think of food security and climate change as if rural agriculture is the only component of the food system affected by climate change. As I'll demonstrate, it impacts all sectors of the food system, and again, as Tara has illustrated. Now, when you try and devolve a food security story down to the urban, in the African context, that tends to then defer to urban agriculture as the only solution to food insecurity and perhaps as the only viable response to climate vulnerability. What we've been working on suggests that there is potentially a much wider set of responses. So I'm going to take you through some of the findings of our research and also just pull out some key points along the way. So the first point was, well, back in 2008 we started doing research on household food insecurity in 11 cities in Southern Africa. I headed up the Cape Town team. And we're starting really with the ways in which households themselves engage the food system. So where are people themselves getting food from, and what does that then tell us about the food system? What does it tell us about food system governance, and what opportunities does it give us to do something different? So the first point we found was, I don't know if you can see my cursor, in the Cape Town context we found that less than 5% of households in the low income areas were doing any kind of own food production, and yet all of the policy attention was there. The regional picture showed a little bit more uptake of urban agriculture, but certainly not the main source of food. The main sources of food were up here in this market sector. And this threw us a number of questions, because in all the cities the same story came through. The households were accessing food from a supermarket, but not very regularly. And on a day-to-day basis they were sourcing from this more informal trade sector. And this was puzzling because we know that, or we're told that the quality of food is better in the supermarkets, the prices are cheaper, the range is more appropriate. So why are households continuing to make decisions that are not making nutritional or educational sense? And so we had to go into household practice and thought about what drives food sourcing, what drives food consumption. Why is it that we're seeing these households shifting their diets from, you know, the traditional diet that Tara was talking to a more westernized diet? Why was it that we weren't seeing this large-scale consumption of pulses and beans, slow-cooked, healthy, cheaper foods? What was driving this? And so part of it's income, and part of it's the geography of the city. If you're commuting 2 hours to and from, you can make very different food choices. But part of it is around what the housing system looks like. And so if you've got limited access to storage, if you've got limited access to refrigeration, if you've got limited access to water and sanitation, it's going to profoundly impact the food choices you make. And you're going to be buying in smaller purchases because you can't buy fresh produce that's going to sit on a shelf if you're in a house that's got extreme temperature gradients. You can't buy a lot of food that's going to take a lot of washing and cooking if you don't have adequate sanitation and water. Now, each of those components have climate change vulnerabilities. So in our context, we're looking at extreme temperature events, we're looking at extreme rainfall events. Each of those increase those vulnerability, and each of those is therefore going to shift what people are sourcing and what people are consuming. So this happens at the household scale, but we then also need to think about what's going on at the neighbourhood scale and start to think about where's the role of local government in all of this. So I'm just shamelessly borrowing some slides from the IID, who did a wonderful piece of work in Kenya, just mapping out hazards and food provisioning. And they walked around with weather balloons with cameras and mapped out the neighbourhoods, and really found where these points of vulnerability and risk were related to dump sites, sewer lines, open space, drains, etc. Now, when you start to see this, you start to see these questions around, well, what then is the role of the city? What can cities start doing differently that can improve food security, improve food safety, and be a little bit more resilient to climate change? Now, it's not just around urban agriculture, it's not just around household provisioning, but it's starting to think about what is the role of urban planning in mitigating some of the risks that are going to be in place with increasing climate change. The third point, excuse me, is that households navigate a range of sources of food. So that earlier image showed where households were sourcing food from, and they source these from different sources on a day-to-day basis. During the month, they will choose to buy from different places, different times of day, they'll buy from different kinds of places. Each of those sources of food has different pathways to get that food to the consumer. The pathway that a loaf of bread takes for a supermarket or an informal trader is quite different. The pathway of a chicken through the system is incredibly different if you're going from an informal trader to a street-side vendor to a supermarket. Just from the Cape Town perspective, we know that the cheapest chickens you could buy are imported from Brazil. The chickens you buy from a street vendor that are live are local. So each one of those has different vulnerabilities to climate change. Just an example from Kisumu, which is one of the cities we're working in. It's the third largest city in Kenya. This is a snapshot of the local fish market. Here there's the local wet fish market. Directly adjacent to it is the local dry fish market. And again, the different kinds of fish that are sold there, some are hyper-local, coming straight from Lake Victoria, some are coming from further afield. Both in Kisumu and in Kitwe in Kenya, we were told of an increasing proportion of fish being brought in from China. So we have an immensely complex food system that's drawing on these multiple sources of food. And each of those sources has its own particular vulnerabilities, be it eutrophication of Lake Victoria, be it typhoons, all of those things interact. Now, with these multiple pathways, you kind of have some sense of resilience, because if there's a crisis going on, the food system can normally adapt and continue to deliver. And our concern is that the current food system is trending towards wiping out diversity, trending towards trying to have a singular system. So what we're seeing in cities is a number of processes that are changing the food system that actually have very little to do with food planning. So what we're seeing is a trend towards support for modernization. We're seeing the kind of rapid expansion of the supermarket sector, the rapid formalization of cities. And part of that is around this narrative of Africa rising, this rising middle class. We need to be modern, we need to move away from the old things. So very little to do with thinking about food, and everything to do with thinking about what the city should be. We're increasingly seeing the marginalization of the informal food sector as pressures put on cities to shut down the markets that are seen as unhealthy, as unruly, as uncontrolled, as backward. So you have this trend towards modernization, this trend towards suppression of the informal food system. And yet those decisions aren't about food or climate change, but they profoundly affect food. Again, just an example from our work in Kitwe in Zambia. You'll find that the supermarkets enter in, bringing all the modern Western foods. And fairly soon after that, you'll find there's an effort to try and clear out the informal traders. And that effort comes in part from pressure from the large retailers who try to dominate the market. And yet, if we know that the food insecure are dependent on being able to navigate this range of food systems, and if we know that these multiple pathways provide some resilience to local, regional, and global climate shocks, there's a concern that this trend towards modernization, this trend towards a single kind of food system, is in fact increasing vulnerability rather than reducing it. So which brings me to my final set of points, which is, so where do we go from here? And I think that the points are, we need to move beyond a production focus, and yet everything seems to be pointing us back to that. We need to move beyond the idealization of the local food system. We seem to, I think, in the African context and well beyond, have this notion that a local food system is the ideal. And yet in the context of climate change and increased climate risk, perhaps there's a need to embrace some of the global as well as some of the local. And how do we validate and valorize both of those systems? We need to continue to support multiple pathways of food, both formal and informal, and recognize ways to strengthen those. And the challenge is that currently, certainly local government doesn't have the capacity to do that. And you'll very rarely find the department in local government that's responsible for the planning that puts in new shopping malls and new supermarkets in communication with those who are tasked with managing the informal food retail sector. You'll find the people pushing urban agriculture are never in communication with those working in retail, for example. So we need to find ways to support these multiple pathways of food. And if we start doing this, if we start to go back to looking at how households are actually getting food, what's taking the food from the field to the fork, and start to interrogate what departments in the city are shaping that, we'll find that there actually are a number of opportunities for cities to engage in generating a climate resilient, food secure city. And that may be around urban planning, that may be around housing, maybe around provision of sanitation, it may be the provision of open spaces, it may be in social networks. But all of these multiple departments have a role in shaping the food system. And the danger is that we end up having a program here, a project here, and they never communicate. So we think there's a need for an overarching food system strategy for African cities. So I think finally the last point is the main messages that I want to take out are that if we're going to develop food policy that works for cities, we need to start with the household practices of the urban poor to understand why they're doing what they're doing and how they might be impacted by policy and work out from there. We need to have food security that recognizes multiple food pathways, and we need to recognize that local government has a number of opportunities to increase climate resilience of the food system. Thank you. Okay, is everyone still there?
Yes, sorry. I think you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I was just taking my time to change the little microphone. Thank you so much, Jane, for that presentation. That was fascinating. And we have lots of questions to ask both you and Tara. So we have about 10 minutes, so we'll try and move through fairly fast. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you first, Jane, just a few questions. So I'll keep your microphone on. The first question is, you talked about how urban planning is very important and the importance to engage local governments. How engaged are they? I think you're pointing to the fact that they may not be at the moment. But if you could give us some examples, perhaps, of some local governments that are engaged, and how do you think you could raise attention to engage more governments at the more local city level officials around the food, climate change, urban nexus?
Yeah. So currently there hasn't been a lot of uptake. The challenge has been that, certainly in the African context, food security has been seen as a rural competence and rural issue. So we're starting to see a shift. One of the cities that's really taken this up has been the city of Windhoek in Namibia, which has partnered with the Belo Horizonte group and is trying to embed a number of policies and programs to address food security. The other thing is the FAO and RUAF are working on this new city region food system assessment. And they're working in some of the same cities that we are. And part of that is to develop local capacity and local interest in this. So it's a long process of stakeholder engagement. But I think that the way that the cities are going to take up the mantle is if there is increased pressure from global agencies to take it up, and if there is increased evidence put on the table for those local governments.
Excellent. And the next question, we had quite a few questions around the relationship between urban areas and rural areas and food systems. What's your view on that relationship between the urban food system and rural areas surrounding?
Is that still to me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously the rural hinterlands are vitally important to urban food security, but I think perhaps too much has been assumed of that. So within our work, we're trying to trace the food effectively from fork to field rather than from field to fork to get a sense of where that food is actually coming from. But I think that there is a need to not think of them as two separate entities. And I know the FAO's group are looking at the city food region and trying to develop city food region policies. We're saying I think we need to take a step back and understand really where the food is actually coming from before you start developing strategies and policies.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Just hold on there because we'll come back with another question, but I'm just going to ask Tara now a few questions. So I've unmuted you, Tara, so you're able to talk. One of the questions was around greenhouse gas intensive foods such as meat and their consumption. So what can really be done here to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
So I think there's two ways of answering that question. One is to say, what can we do on the production side to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And the second is to look at what can be done to address consumption practice. So I'll focus mainly on the consumption practice, but I'll say something about production first. I think there is, and there's a lot of research underway that's trying to look at how you reduce emissions intensity of production through changes in breeding and in feeding and in housing, and some of those are synergistic with, and some of these are detrimental to animal welfare. So I think we have to, and there are swings and roundabouts when it comes to things like increasing the intensity of production, but becoming more dependent on things like dedicated feedstuffs, which are use land, good quality arable land. So there's lots of trade-offs there that we need to engage with and think about if we're going to improve the productivity of livestock systems. But there's also some very useful work that's going on, and there's quite a lot that can be done to improve productivity of livestock systems in sub-Saharan Africa in ways that are good for livelihoods and good for animal welfare and good for greenhouse gas emissions. But on the consumption side, there is this general sense that current trajectories in demand, the rise in demand for animal products is somehow inevitable and immutable. And I think there's one answer that I would give is that, you know, policy up until recently has been driven focused on how we do more. How we produce more food, how we address hunger, and people have been very successful at that, and it's a completely new way of thinking. And this isn't just about food; it's about lots of other things. How we actually do less, or how we do different, and that's more of a challenge. I think the approach, if you go to the health promotion literature, many of the approaches that have been taken to address sort of healthy eating, fruit and vegetables, 5 a day, obesity, etc., through the provision of information and the assumption that if people are informed, then they will make the right rational choice, have been proved wrong, and the health promotion community are the first to admit this, that simply waving a handy leaflet at somebody is not going to do the job, and the same applies for getting us to address our consumption habits. We need we need to steer from government, we need shifts in regulations, we need shifts in pricing policies, we need changes in public procurement, and actually that's where cities can have a really, really strong role to play, because people eat in hospitals, they eat in schools, they eat in subsidised workplace canteens, and all these are really great opportunities for intervening in what's on offer, what isn't on offer, what the price of different foods are, how they're promoted, how they're displayed, and so on and so forth. So I think there are huge opportunities within urban areas at all scales to actually change the context of consumption. So don't focus on the individual, but focus on the signals that the individual gets when he or she goes to consume.
Thanks, Tara. Another question from Eugene was, what are some of the most promising urban-centred greenhouse gas mitigation solutions, projects that will be successful or could be successful? Have you got any examples that that you've heard of or know of or could imagine?
I think there's lots and lots of experimentation. So, for example, there's experimentation with alternative food systems that include but go beyond urban agriculture. I'm thinking of London and the UK here. So community initiatives that try and produce a bit of food within the kind of the urban boundary, but also have very clear sourcing criteria and decisions. I'm thinking of an organisation such as called Growing Communities here in London. I think there have also been experiments with things like getting small-scale producers and vendors to try and pool their logistics infrastructure so that you get sort of hub and spoke things rather than, you know, one van going around 3/4 of empty with you know, a bag of carrots for one particular you know, a buyer, to actually try and consolidate that. But as far as I know, all of these are fairly small scale and experimental, and what we don't have is the really kind of the research that actually tries to measure and quantify what the impacts of these alternative systems are and how they might compare with an alternative. And I'm really with Jane on the kind of the thing that we mustn't romanticize small scale or local or alternative. We need to experiment as much as we can, and we need to recognize that experimentation, but we also need to monitor and measure and evaluate what the impacts are, rather than assuming that if it's small scale, if it's alternative, it must be a good thing.
Okay, I have another question here for you, Tara, before I ask Jane one, and this is from Florence, and she wants to ask you whether the concept of sustainable diets would respond to both under and over nutrition and address environmental, health and social dimensions. So is that a way of representing these discussions over nutrition, malnutrition in the form of under and also over in the form of obesity? Are you following the sustainable diets discussions, or is it one
very much so. Yes, I mean, so is there a one size fits all diet that is sustainable and healthy? No, because humans are extremely adaptable species, and there are many ways in which people can consume and be healthy, and that sustainability is a function not just of local context as well, and local geography. But I think there are some overarching broad principles that apply both to low income and high income countries that could be modified as needed, and one is diversity of foods in order to ensure spread of micronutrients. The second is energy balance, and again that speaks both to the undernourished and the overconsumers. Eat as much as you need and no more, but no less in terms of calorie intakes, and because excessive consumption is arguably a waste of the embedded emissions associated with that, and then base your diets around more plants and less meat, which doesn't mean no meat. It doesn't mean no animal source foods, but it means that the general principle should be basing your consumption around a diverse range of plant-based foods with meat eaten in low quantities, if that's appropriate. So I think those principles can apply in different contexts, and of course the less diverse the diet, the proportionally more important the micronutrient-rich meat content might be. So, and the way of improving the sustainability of that is to expand the diversity of the diet and the plant component.
Excellent. Okay. Jane, I'm going to ask you a question, and thank you for that answer, Tara. Jane, is food waste an issue, or is it considered in the work that you're doing with local governments?
Yeah, in the African context, food waste takes a slightly different direction, because the majority in most of Africa is post-harvest loss rather than food waste in the kind of Western understanding, although increasingly that is the case. Food waste in cities has been considered more of a health problem than an environmental problem per se, with pests and rodents and burning. But there are increasing efforts to try and think about better ways to use food waste. So we know that in I think it's in Nakuru in Kenya, there are efforts to take urban food waste into community composting and beyond. So there are efforts to ameliorate it. We have, in the South African context and in the Windhoek context, an increasing effort towards doing food banks and then thinking about how to defer waste from landfill. So it's an emerging field, but it hasn't quite got the cachet that it does in Europe and North America for sure.
Excellent, thank you for that. Now I've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to both give you 30 seconds. I'm going to start with you, Jane, just to say, what if you could do an interesting piece of research and you had money given to you, what would be your choice to focus on in this climate change, food, urban area nexus? I'm putting on the spot here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to ask Tara the same question, so Tara, get ready.
Gosh, I've never been offered a large amount of money like that.
I think what would be your priority?
I think it would be, again, coming back to individual households and really understanding what's going to happen in their households in a 2 to 5 temperature extreme with regard to their food practices.
Excellent, thank you. Very nice, short answer. Excellent. Tara?
Okay, well, I think there's quite a lot that I'd like to do on the production side in order to understand how the evolution of production systems and supply chains affect the environmental sustainability of what it is we consume. But if I had a choice, I would take a city like London and I would conduct lots of experiments into lots of interventions aimed at shifting people's consumption patterns. So I do it in workplaces, I do it in schools, I do it in supermarkets, and somehow I try and get local authorities and the food industry and civil society organisations all kind of together trying to focus on how we might experiment with a range of interventions and then figure out what works.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that answer. I know that it's a question that puts you on the spot at the very end, but it's always a dream to sort of be offered the chance to have funding and think about what you'd really like to spend it on in this subject. It's a very important subject, and all of us in the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative, that is UNEP, the Urban Food Network, and the Foundation Nicolas Hulot, we're really pleased to be able to offer this session and to start this work and start the focus on climate change urban areas and food. And I'm just going to draw your attention to these webinars in the future and thank the speakers. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to end the session. Thank you to all the speakers. Bye.